Hey guys, Buildzoid here with another PCB breakdown for you today, and today we're not using paint any longer because I can do this. This is awesome. This is way nicer to use than paint when we need to move around the PCB. So today we're going to be taking a look at the R9-290X Vapor-X. This uses a different PCB from the 290. So if you have the 290, none of what I say here applies to that card, just so you know. And I basically decided we're going to do this PCB because I'm still researching some stuff for the other PCB breakdown videos, and while I'm doing that research, I decided we might as well cover this. Because this thing is an awesome PCB, mostly because of this weird layout of the V-Core VRM. Like, you never see this kind of VRM layout. And we're going to discuss why it is that nobody ever does this, and we're also going to discuss some of the benefits of doing this, because it does have some benefits that Sapphire actually really uses on this card to the fullest extent. We're also going to cover what this thing up here is, because I thought it was super cool. I don't know if that actually worked, but it's not just a PCB extension for the hell of having a larger looking PCB. It does theoretically have a functional purpose. And then obviously we have this set of VRMs here, and that's probably split like that, where one of these is core auxiliary and one of those is memory voltage. And we're going to cover all that right now. So let's start off with the V-Core VRM, which is this giant block right here. So first things first, it's huge. There's the reason why this isn't used, this VRM layout, it's really big. It's really long. It takes up a huge amount of your PCB space, and it generates only one voltage. So that's one of the reasons why it's not popular. The other reasons why it's not popular is because this is your high side MOSFET, right? Well, these are your high side MOSFETs, right? And also these are also high side MOSFETs. So that's all high side MOSFETs, right? Your main 12 volt capacitor bank is this. And the high side MOSFET, for those of you who don't know what it does, it switches your 12 volts. That's the thing that turns on and off 12 volts into your VRM. The low side MOSFET just sits there to cycle current. To cycle the current through the inductor when the high side turns off. So these switch 12 volts on and off. The problem here is that these guys at the very end of the VRM, well, I don't know, depends on how you define it. These guys are really far away from your main capacitor bank. So in theory, there should be some issues with voltage regulation just because of how far away they are from the 12 volt capacitor bank. So if these are currently the ones, if either of these phases is currently on the main, being cycled, and there's a giant spike in current draw, it may, if you have a transient load go on, so basically your power draw goes up really quickly out of nowhere, you may get a bit of lag, you may get a bit of voltage drop as this capacitor bank has to deliver power across this giant distance. Because these guys right here will discharge basically instantly. Those are ceramic capacitors. They hold very little power. So if these two phases suddenly get heavily loaded because they're currently being switched and you get a transient, that's a problem. Major problem right there. So that's one of the reasons why it's not used. It basically has slightly worse voltage regulation because of that. Obviously, there's ways to get around that depending on how you actually have the VRM wired. You can do all kinds of funky tricks where, say, this one fires and then this one fires, instead of going depending on which order you fire the VRMs in, you can get around that. So it's not inherently wrong, but it can have some issues. The other issue is, well, from this area to there is a very long distance. Even if we do a straight line, that's a really big distance to have your core voltage travel for basically no reason. So again, same issue applies. If there's a sudden spike in current draw, luckily a sudden spike in current draw from the core will mostly impact the low side, and If these are off, then it'll mostly just impact the low side, and there's a lot of low side already available here. But yeah, again, you just have unnecessary potential for voltage drop and issues with voltage regulation because of unnecessarily long distances, which is why most GPU manufacturers opt for a VRM that would be located like that, because then your distance from here to there is short, and there is short, and you can put your capacitor bank right behind it instead of having it relatively far away from some of your high sides. Now, there is a few tricks Sapphire could have used to get around all of these issues, or at least minimize them, because they're just inherent to this design. And yeah, so this should have unnecessarily high voltage drop, and it might have bad transient response, just based on how it's laid out. However, there is a few tricks they could have used to get around it. And really, you'd need to take like an oscilloscope and really measure how this VRM behaves compared to other 290X VRMs before you could say it is definitely the worst or worse than some other ones. So yeah, it's just interesting that they chose this layout. Now, this layout does have a few benefits. So the downsides are big PCB, potential for voltage regulation issues due to distances. The benefits are this VRM is really spread out. So basically, these guys are, they produce the bulk of the heat in a VRM. These get really hot. And in this layout, there's a lot of space between them, which, is really beneficial because the further apart these guys are, the less they actually heat each other up. So they're easier to cool because you have less heat density. Essentially, you have more area to pump the heat through. So this VRM inherently runs really cool. If I'm not mistaken, there's reports of this card's VRM running in the below 70 degrees in some cases. So yeah, this design runs really cool, and that is a very nice benefit because obviously that gives you some extra current handling capability because the MOSFETs derate with temperature. It also boosts your efficiency because your RDS on is higher at higher temperatures as well. So yeah, there's a few you get huge temperature benefits with this VRM layout, but you do lose out on, you get potential issues with voltage regulation. You'd really need to test that really hard. It's really hard to say just from a PCB picture if that would be inherently bad. And even if there are transient load voltage regulation related issues on the card, they might not be so bad that they actually affect core overclocking capabilities. So this VRM is mostly not used because it takes up a huge amount of PCB space, and the other issues are just, they can be worked around for the most part. So then, let's talk about actual VRM power capabilities. So these are 6894 direct FETs from International Rectifier. So the 6894s are rated for 150 or 160 amps at 25 degrees, one of the two, and 25 degrees case temperature, so that's MOSFET temperature, not just general VRM temperature. And at 125 degrees, they derate down to 71 amps. So huge amount of current available on the low side. This VRM runs very cool, so that 71 amp rating basically doesn't apply because this shouldn't really ever go over 90 degrees, if even getting above 80. Again, this VRM runs really cool compared to all the other 290X VRMs because of the layout. So you have a huge amount of current capability on your low side. Then your high side, which are these guys, those are 6811s. Those are capable of around 37 amps at 125 degrees, and give me a second, 70 amps at 25 degrees. 74, I think, exactly. 70 something. You get the idea. So yeah, and this, this massive difference in ratings is because your high side doesn't spend a whole lot of time on. A 20% duty cycle would be 2.4 volts. So yeah, if your high side spent 20% of each switching cycle through the phases turned on, you'd be getting 2.4 volts, which is a ton of voltage, so obviously it never ever runs that long. So those things don't get turned on for very, very long, so the current rating can be lower because that's a continuous current rating, and you can actually run higher currents for short periods of time through most MOSFETs. As long as the period of time is short enough, you don't have to worry about pushing a lot more current through it. So the 37 amp rating might sound low, but you can certainly push more than that through them in a VRM which is very low voltage. In a high voltage VRM where you might have a really long duty cycle, then yeah, you'd have to go with a continuous rating. Now the other thing is these go, but since these rate up to 70 amps at 25 degrees, at around 60 degrees you can expect them to do 50 amps continuous drain current. So you have, if this VRM is running at decent temperatures, so say around 60, 70 degrees, you have 500 amps on tap for your core voltage, because this is a 10 phase. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's mirrored. It's a 10 phase VRM, so you have a 500 amps of current available to, play with when overclocking. So a huge amount of power is available. The high side can obviously handle way more than 500 amps, but that 500 amps figure is mostly because, you don't want to overstrain the high side, because that's generally what goes out when you have the different current ratings, because the low side could probably handle, say, 1,000 amps or something ridiculous like that, but the high side wouldn't be really able to keep up with that at higher core voltages. So just go with the 500 amps, which is still a ton of current. That's so much current, I have no idea when you would actually end up using that, because even under LN2, the 290X only uses about 600 watts, and you need 1.5 volts to do that, so the current, is lower because of the really high core voltage, because wattage is voltage divided by, watts divided by voltage gives you current. So so really no concerns. There is no way you're blowing this VRM up, even if you ran the card on LN2 and ran it really, really, really hard on LN2. So very, very, very nice VRM. Now, how does it achieve its 10 phases? It's using the IR3567B because it's a 290X card. All the 290X cards need to use the 3567B. The 3567B is an international rectifier, 6+2 phase voltage controller. So how does this get 10 phases? They're doubled up. It's running through a set of doublers. There's really nothing wrong with that because they're still using 5 phases. I'd complain if they were doubling a 3 phase. If they took 3 phases off of the controller and doubled those, I would complain about that. If they're doubling 5, then that's just it might not be super cost effective to put a 12th, 2 more extra phases to get a 12 phase. That's just kind of ridiculous at this point, especially since this is a more gaming-oriented card than an overclocking-oriented card. Because Sapphire is more gaming-oriented than overclocking-oriented. So you don't get all the fancy features like a Asus Matrix or a Lightning offers with the core voltage, with the extra voltage controls. This doesn't have those, but still, the VRM is really, really high power, runs very cool, so it's, a nice card, and the PCB is really unique, which is why I wanted to cover it. It uses the 3567B just like any other 290X, because that's the only voltage controller you can use on these cards, and it doubles up 5 phases off of that. So that's how it gets the 10 phase VRM there. Now, if we slide over to here, these are 2 separate VRMs. These are not one VRM, or they shouldn't be one VRM. They should be separate because this being a 290X needs 4 major voltages: 0.9 core voltage, memory voltage, auxiliary, 0.95 volts. Right? Those are your 4 voltages that a 290X needs. Also, a Fiji needs those, Polaris needs those. Basically every AMD card, as far as I know, needs those 4 voltages. All the newer GCN stuff needs those. 0.95 volts, I can't find it on the PCB right now. It's somewhere on there. It has to be there. That's what supplies the voltage for all your display stuff. And it's also a very important voltage when LN2 overclocking, which is why I said this is not a good card for LN2 overclocking, because you don't get 0.95 volt rail control. On, say, a Lightning, you can actually manually control that voltage. On this card, you can't do that. You can try do a hard mod, but obviously that's really complicated, and it's better if you just have software control. So yeah, so that's 0.95 volts is somewhere on the back of the PCB. It might even be on the front. It's definitely in this sort of area because there's enough componentry there to do it. I just can't find it because PCB picture is not big enough. Well, not detailed enough. So that covers, so we have V-core, we have 0.95 volts taken care of, and then these two have to be separate because there's no other, these two have to be separate because there's no other major, VRM on this card. So basically one of these has to take care of memory voltage, one of these has to take care of auxiliary. I'm not sure which one does which, but they don't both do the same voltage. They both do one of the two voltages. Now this is surprisingly enough using different MOSFETs from the main V-core VRM. These are 6725s. These are rated at 170 amps at 25 degrees and derate down to, if I'm not mistaken now, give me a moment, I have the data sheet right here. Yeah, they derate down to 62 amps at 125 degrees. There are two of these, and I think this might be because this might not be as adequately, like the cooling in this, like, yeah, these are closer together. These are gonna run hotter than this here. So I think that's why we have two low sides that are so ridiculously overrated. So again, your low side on both of these is 120 amps. The high side MOSFET, I can't identify these. This is probably a 6711, so 40 amps at 125 degrees and 80 amps or 84 amps at 25 degrees, if I remember correctly. It should be something like that. I know they do 40 amps at 125 because they are better than the 6811s. I remember that much for sure. So again, no concerns here because basically memory and auxiliary really doesn't use a lot of power. Memory doesn't use a lot of power either. So no concerns here. Both very nice VRMs. Unfortunately, you don't get software voltage control for memory voltage, and you don't get software voltage control for 0.95 volts. So this is really not a card I would use for like LN2 overclocking, even though this is a card I really, really want to have just because this PCB is so freaking awesome. Just look at it. So pretty. Finally, let's cover this thing up here. This is really cool. This is basically a cooling thing. It's basically a heatsink for the PCB. I do believe that's probably just hooked straight into the ground plane. So the ground plane is, one giant, well, not one giant layer. It's several giant slabs of copper just going through the card. It's a real pain to solder onto that because it's basically a giant heatsink. Now, the idea with this up here is basically, you can see this thermal pad here. This basically is hooked into what I think it's the ground plane because I can't think of any other plane that it would be reasonable to hook this into. So that would be hooked into the ground plane. The ground plane is present everywhere. So this is going to be hooked up to basically every inch of the PCB through a layer of copper, right? And that means that any heat that gets into the ground plane, assuming that, it's basically going to sink heat from the entire PCB. Assuming that, depending on how hot spots are laid out and all that, because obviously heat only goes from heat only goes from the hot area to the colder area, so if between one warm area there's a hotter spot, then obviously there won't be any heat transfer through that. Only that hot spot will be dumping its heat. But yeah, basically the idea behind this is it provides cooling for the PCB through the copper plane inside the PCB, which I think is super, super cool. I don't know if this works. I don't even know how you would test if this works properly. I guess you could try, like, isolate that plane somehow and then, like, dump some kind of coolant on it and see if that brings down the rest of the card's temperature. Maybe something like that. But either way, Sapphire decided it would be cool to do this kind of heat sinking thing. So I think, yeah, it's freaking awesome that they tried out something like this on a card, and just wanted to point that out. I think that's a really, really cool thing. I wonder if it worked. If it worked, that's great. I mean, this was one of the coolest running 290Xs built, so they did something right, and that might be part of what they did right. So yeah, I think this is an awesome card, and that's an awesome feature, and this is a gorgeous PCB, and that's the end of the video. So thank you for watching. Press that like button, press that subscribe button if you haven't pressed it already. Don't press it again if you've already pressed it before, because that would unsubscribe you. We don't want you doing that. I don't want you doing that. And yeah, so like, share, subscribe, we covered those. Oh yeah, and if you would like to see more actually hardcore overclocking content, there is a donate link down in the description below. You know, something needs to fund my ridiculous consumption of LN2. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.